Washington didn't wake up to an announcement. It woke up to a realization. By the time U.S. analysts noticed something had changed, it was already done. No press conference, no emergency summit, no late-night statement from Ottawa, just a quiet shift in the flow of power that left policymakers staring at screens, asking the same question at the same time. When did this happen? Because in a single calculated move, a Canadian province most Americans only think about when gas prices spiked did something China had been trying and failing to do for more than 20 years. Alberta didn't threaten, it didn't lobby, it didn't negotiate through federal channels, it didn't wait, it acted. And in doing so, it exposed something Washington has spent decades refusing to admit, that the United States does not control the energy system it believes it commands, that the leverage it assumes is guaranteed is in reality conditional, fragile, and quietly slipping north. When I look at how this unfolded, what's striking isn't just what Alberta did, it's how little warning there was. No political theater, no ideological framing, no permission requested from the federal government. Power moved without asking to be seen. That's what makes this moment dangerous. For years, American policymakers treated Canadian energy like a fixed constant, predictable, friendly, automatically aligned, something you could build an entire national strategy around without ever questioning who really held the switch. That assumption just collapsed because while Washington was busy debating energy independence on cable news, Alberta was rewiring the system underneath it. And by the time the implications became visible, the leverage had already shifted. This wasn't a rebellion. It wasn't a crisis. It was far more unsettling than that. It was a demonstration. A proof that power doesn't always announce itself, and that the most consequential changes don't come from superpowers or summits, but from actors willing to move while everyone else is still asking for approval. And here's the part no one in Washington wants to say out loud yet. If a single province can do this, quietly, efficiently, and without federal authorization, then the entire North American energy order is far more unstable than anyone has been willing to admit. And this is only the beginning, because what Alberta just revealed isn't limited to Canada or even to energy. It exposes a blind spot at the heart of American power itself. One that's about to force a reckoning Washington isn't ready for. That's where this story actually starts. The belief was simple. Canadian energy was effectively American energy, secure, predictable, friendly, an extension of U.S. power that required no serious contingency planning and no real negotiation. Oil flowed south, pipelines stayed open, and policymakers congratulated themselves on having a reliable partner they didn't need to think about too deeply. That illusion became the foundation of American energy strategy. When politicians talked about energy independence, this was the unspoken assumption underneath it. Domestic production plus guaranteed Canadian supply. A system so stable it felt permanent, something you could model, forecast, and build national security doctrine around without ever questioning who actually held the leverage. But stability, as it turns out, was mistaken for control. When I examine the architecture of U.S. energy planning, what stands out is how much of it depended on predictability rather than authority. Pipelines assumed cooperation, refineries assumed compliance, contracts assumed continuity. Everything was designed around the idea that Canada, and by extension its provinces, would always behave as expected. No one in Washington seriously planned for the alternative because Canada wasn't seen as a variable. It was seen as background, a friendly constant in a volatile world, and Alberta in particular was treated less like an autonomous power center and more like a resource zone that would always align with federal decisions and American interests. That was the illusion. What Alberta exposed is that the United States never controlled the system. It merely benefited from it. And the moment that benefit became conditional, the entire structure was revealed to be far weaker than advertised. This is the uncomfortable truth Washington has been avoiding. Energy security based on assumptions is not security at all. It's borrowed stability, and borrowed stability can be withdrawn without warning, which is exactly what happened next. Because while U.S. strategists were busy managing optics, narratives, and long-term forecasts, Alberta was doing something far more disruptive. It was acting inside the system without making noise. Not loudly, not provocatively, but decisively. What Alberta did wasn't dramatic on the surface, which is why so many people missed it. There were no speeches, no declarations of autonomy, no federal showdowns broadcast on television. Instead, Alberta moved with precision, identifying the narrow points where action mattered more than approval and then stepping through them. Rather than waiting for federal momentum, the province engaged directly with the infrastructure, the markets, and the stakeholders that actually move energy in the real world. It treated the system not as a political hierarchy, but as a network, one where control flows to those who act, not those who regulate. Economists didn't see it coming because they were watching the wrong indicators. Political analysts missed it because there was no confrontation to analyze. Even industry executives were caught off guard because they assumed every meaningful change would pass through Ottawa first. It didn't. Every presumed barrier, environmental review delays, federal permissions, regulatory choke points, turned out to be less solid than advertised when confronted by a province willing to operate at the edges of authority instead of waiting at the center. And that's the key shift. Alberta didn't break the rules. It revealed which rules actually mattered, and in doing so, it showed that the real levers of power were never where Washington, or even Ottawa, thought they were. By the time the implications became clear, the move was already irreversible. Energy flows had been reoriented, relationships had been recalibrated, and the assumption of automatic American access quietly expired. This wasn't chaos, it was competence. And that's what makes it so dangerous, because now the question is no longer what Alberta did. It's who else realizes they can do the same thing. And once that realization spreads, the illusion of control doesn't just fade, it collapses. For decades, China tried every angle, every channel, every billion-dollar negotiation imaginable. State-owned enterprises were deployed. Diplomatic campaigns ran for years. Backroom deals, boardroom pressures, even Ottawa's political corridors were tested. Beijing believed access to North America's energy was a matter of persistence, capital, and influence. And yet it failed. Why? Because China treated the system as if the rules were what they seemed. They believed Ottawa controlled everything. They assumed federal bureaucracy was the barrier, and that if they pushed hard enough, pressed long enough, or sweetened the incentives enough, they could negotiate their way in. But the Canadian system was never centralized in the way China imagined. Approval and authority were conditional. Real power was provincial, embedded in local control, and exercised by those willing to act without waiting for permission. Enter Alberta. Alberta didn't throw money at the problem. It didn't beg, lobby, or negotiate endlessly. It bypassed the gatekeepers entirely. It moved directly, decisively, and quietly. And in doing so, it achieved in months what Beijing could not accomplish in decades. There was no fanfare, no threat, no spectacle, just a single, well-executed decision that rewrote the landscape of North American energy. This contrast is stark. Scale, capital, and global influence couldn't overcome caution and bureaucracy. Boldness and initiative did. And here's the lesson Washington refuses to acknowledge. Power is not defined by size or resources. It's defined by the ability to act when others hesitate, which brings us to the U.S., the nation that believed itself in control. For years, the American narrative was comforting. Canada is a loyal partner. Pipelines run south. Contracts are dependable. Energy independence can be maintained with minimal attention to northern neighbors. It was a worldview built on predictability, not actual leverage. That worldview is broken. Alberta's action revealed a strategic blind spot so deep that Washington didn't even realize it existed. The U.S. was not merely surprised, it was unprepared. Supply chains, contracts, and assumptions about reliability suddenly needed recalibration. The so-called certainty of American energy security was not only disrupted, it had been illusory from the start. And this is the part that matters most. It's not just logistics or economics, it's psychological. For decades, the U.S. treated Canadian provinces as passive players, assuming compliance and alignment. That assumption is no longer valid. Loyalty is not guaranteed. Stability is not guaranteed. Predictability is not guaranteed. Alberta has shifted the terms of engagement. The U.S. must now negotiate, adapt, and anticipate, not dictate. What was once a given is now conditional. What was assumed to be controlled is now contingent. And if this blind spot exists in energy, it almost certainly exists elsewhere, and in trade, in policy, in international alliances. Because the lesson is universal. Washington believed it held the map. Alberta quietly redrew it. And the question now is, how many more blind spots are still hiding in plain sight? For decades, Ottawa has been portrayed as the ultimate authority in Canada. Federal oversight, environmental approvals, and regulatory frameworks created the illusion that the provinces were subordinate, that every decision flowed through a centralized system, and that authority was absolute. Washington, Beijing, even corporate boardrooms abroad all assumed Ottawa was the gatekeeper, the source of control. Alberta just proved that assumption wrong. Federal power, it turns out, is conditional. It only works when the provinces comply. When a province recognizes its own leverage, when it sees the rules not as walls but as optional pathways, the federal system becomes what it always was underneath the surface, a framework waiting for consent. Alberta didn't ask for permission, it didn't negotiate the steps or seek approval, it simply acted. And that action demonstrated unequivocally that Ottawa's authority is effective only if those holding the real levers choose to respect it. The consequences are profound. Every policy, every assumption about centralized Canadian control now has a caveat. The province may act independently. What was thought to be Ottawa's command, the final word, is now demonstrably negotiable. Energy, trade, and infrastructure can be influenced not by a federal mandate, but by those with direct access to the resources, capital, and networks that make action possible. And this brings us to an often overlooked but decisive factor, the Indigenous communities. For years, First Nations people were framed as obstacles. Protests delayed pipelines. Legal challenges created uncertainty. In political narratives, Indigenous involvement was often reduced to interference, something to be managed or bypassed. But Alberta's approach reframes that dynamic entirely. Indigenous communities are no longer simply petitioners or protesters. They are partners, owners, and holders of authority over the very infrastructure that moves energy across the continent. Ownership changes everything. By having stakes in pipelines, refineries, and export corridors, Indigenous communities transform from potential points of friction into pillars of stability. Markets, investors, and foreign buyers now see this as a guarantee of reliability. The legal frameworks that once slowed projects have been leveraged into legitimacy, continuity, and strategic leverage. Where Washington assumed predictable federal oversight would dictate outcomes, Alberta's alignment with Indigenous partners demonstrates a decentralized, agile model of power that cannot be ignored. This is more than just a provincial strategy. It is a structural shift. Energy flows are no longer solely controlled by federal policy or corporate interests. They are co-managed, reinforced, and protected by Indigenous authority, giving Alberta a tactical advantage that was invisible to the world until now. The message is clear. Control is no longer top-down. It is negotiated, earned, and exercised where the real levers exist. And with Indigenous communities as empowered stakeholders, Alberta has created a new axis of influence that challenges both Ottawa and Washington. This is not a marginal change. It's a transformation in how power is distributed in North America. Subtle, quiet, and nearly invisible until it reshapes the map entirely. Alberta didn't just shift the rules within Canada. It created something entirely new, a strategic triangle connecting Alberta, the United States, and Asia. I call it the Alberta Triangle, and it is quietly redefining the global energy chessboard. Through direct access to U.S. refineries, Alberta now holds influence over American energy security in a way that was unimaginable just months ago. Washington, which long assumed it could dictate terms or rely on default access, must now negotiate. Pipelines, contracts, and deliveries are no longer automatic. They are contingent, shaped by Alberta's decisions and timelines. At the same time, Alberta is reaching into Asian markets, Japan, South Korea, and other industrial nations that depend heavily on energy imports, providing long-term stability and access that bypassed Ottawa entirely. By offering predictability and legitimacy where bureaucracies and delays once dominated, Alberta positions itself as a preferred partner, not a subordinate player. And the third corner, Indigenous partnerships, ensures resilience that Washington and foreign powers cannot easily disrupt. These alliances guarantee continuity, legitimacy, and operational security. Pipelines that were once vulnerable to protests or lawsuits now operate with certainty, backed by stakeholders whose authority cannot be ignored. The Alberta Triangle is more than geography. It is leverage, a multidimensional network where energy flows, policy decisions, and strategic influence intersect. It allows Alberta to set conditions, create access, and wield power in ways that have forced the United States, China, and other global players to rethink their approach entirely. And the recalibration isn't hypothetical, it's happening now. Global markets are quietly adjusting. Contracts are being renegotiated. Supply chains are being reassessed. Buyers in Tokyo and Seoul, who once relied on Middle Eastern imports or long-term agreements fraught with volatility, now see Alberta as a stable and reliable source, but only under conditions set by Edmonton and its Indigenous partners. Washington is learning to negotiate from a position of reliance rather than authority. What was once assumed to be American control over Canadian energy is now conditional, and every American industrial or strategic decision has to account for this new reality. Even Beijing, which spent decades attempting to penetrate the Canadian energy market, now faces a provincial administration that does not answer to Ottawa. State-owned enterprises, diplomatic missions, and billions of dollars cannot recreate the same advantage that Alberta achieved with initiative, timing, and local partnerships. The ripple effects are multiplying. Global energy flows, financial models, and risk assessments are all being rewritten. What seemed stable and predictable is now contingent. The rules of engagement have changed, quietly, decisively, and permanently. And as these adjustments unfold, one truth becomes unavoidable. Alberta is no longer just a provincial actor. It has become a central node in a new, multi-vector system of energy leverage that will shape North America and the world for decades to come. The question now is not whether this shift will be felt. It already is. The real question is, how far will it ripple, and who else will realize they can act before the world even notices? We are standing at a crossroads, and Alberta's move has created 3 possible futures for North America, each with profound consequences. The first scenario is managed containment. Ottawa and Washington recognize the shift, but only cautiously. Alberta's independence is acknowledged, policies are slowly recalibrated, and negotiations resume under the old frameworks, now strained. The triangle exists, but it's fragile. The U.S. still feels in control, even as cracks in its assumed authority continue to widen beneath the surface. Stability is preserved for now, but the tension simmers, and every decision carries the weight of this new uncertainty. The second scenario is provincial awakening. Other provinces take notice. Saskatchewan, Manitoba, even Quebec begin exploring autonomous agreements, circumventing Ottawa when it suits them. Canada becomes a network of semi-independent actors, each wielding leverage directly with global markets. The federal government's authority is no longer the default. It is conditional, negotiated, and sometimes secondary to provincial strategy. What was once a monolithic system transforms into a patchwork of power, unpredictably interacting with the world stage. The third and most consequential scenario is global leverage shift. Alberta continues its expansion, solidifying influence in both the US and Asia, while Indigenous partnerships secure infrastructure and legitimacy. North America's energy landscape becomes decentralized but interdependent. Washington now negotiates from a position of reliance. Beijing, Tokyo, and other global powers must constantly adjust strategy in real time. The continent is no longer simply a supplier-consumer relationship. It is a multi-dimensional chessboard where leverage has quietly moved north. Each of these futures carries risks and opportunities. What is undeniable is that the assumptions of stability, obedience, and centralized control are gone. What was once theoretical is now operational. Alberta has rewritten the playbook, and the rest of the continent, and indeed the world, is reacting. But this isn't just about pipelines, contracts, or oil prices. The deeper meaning is far more unsettling. What Alberta's action demonstrates is a universal lesson in power. Those who move decisively while others hesitate hold influence far greater than those who wait for permission or authority. Geography, ownership, and initiative have trumped bureaucracy, capital, and global scale. The province has revealed that control is never guaranteed, that predictability is an illusion, and that the true levers of influence are often invisible until someone dares to reach for them. History is full of these moments. Quiet shifts that break assumptions, that redefine who is in charge without anyone noticing until the consequences are unavoidable. Alberta's move is one of them. And the most unsettling realization for Washington, Ottawa, and even Beijing is this: the maps we believed permanent are already being rewritten. Energy is no longer merely a commodity. It is leverage, it is influence, it is power. And the triangle formed by Alberta, the US, and Asia is a blueprint for a world where initiative, not position, defines authority. This is the deeper lesson. The question is no longer can they act, it is who else will. And when the next player steps forward, the ripple may become a wave that changes everything we thought we understood about control in North America and beyond. The shockwaves from Alberta's bold move are far from over. The question now is who will be next. Other provinces are watching closely. They see what Alberta accomplished. Initiative over bureaucracy, decisive action over waiting for permission, and partnerships over assumptions of compliance. Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and even Quebec could follow, each with unique leverage over resources, infrastructure, or strategic markets. The precedent is set. The moment you realize power is in your hands, not at the top of a hierarchy, is the moment the rules change. Beyond Canada, the lesson resonates globally. Governments, investors, and industrial players in Washington, Beijing, Tokyo, and beyond are forced to reassess their assumptions. They now understand that stability can no longer be taken for granted, and that the so-called constants of international energy are subject to the boldness of actors few would have previously considered decisive. This is not a single event. It is a recalibration of power. One province has proven that agility, strategy, and the courage to act quietly can outweigh decades of planning by even the most powerful states. The question is no longer if someone will follow Alberta's lead, but when and who will shift the next triangle of influence. The final reckoning isn't about Alberta alone. It's about a world waking up to a new order. One where initiative, geography, and strategic foresight dictate influence far more than sheer size, wealth, or authority. Washington assumed control. Beijing assumed patience and capital could dominate. The global system assumed predictability. All of those assumptions have been shattered. And so we arrive at the conclusion: the map has changed. The North American energy landscape is no longer centralized. Control is no longer assumed. Leverage has quietly moved north, supported by provincial authority and indigenous legitimacy. The United States must negotiate rather than dictate. Asia must adapt to new supply channels. And every nation that relied on old assumptions must now rethink strategy. This is a moment of clarity. Power is fluid, authority is conditional, and foresight belongs to those willing to act while others wait. Alberta has proven that. So here's what I want you to take away. Watch closely. Every decision, every province, every actor now carries potential consequences that could reshape the continent. If you think you understand the game already, think again. The board has shifted. Subscribe, follow, and stay tuned to State Brief. The world is changing quietly, decisively, and fast. If you want to see who will move next, who will seize leverage, and how the balance of power is rewritten, you need to be watching this space. Because the provinces aren't waiting, and neither should you.